at these two shapes for a second. Obviously, they're quite different from each other. They're definitely not the same in a lot of ways. But what we need to do is we need to match up these shapes with the correct names for these shapes. So if you would, figure out which one is the taquit and which one is the baluba. So get in your mind, make your decision, which is the taquit and which is the baluba. It shouldn't take long, you should just have a reaction to it. So, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, raise your hand. Is the one on the left, the rounded one, is that the taquit? Is that the baluba? Alright, so the pointy one is the taquit. Awesome. That is so good to know because that means that all of us are just like the rest of the world. Everybody thinks that. And those are not real words and they have nothing to do with these shapes. But it's amazing how names of things make us think certain things. I mean, baluba just sounds like one of them, and taquit sounds like the other for whatever reason. We can thank some psychologist 100 years ago who figured out that fun little test. But think too about north and south. I mean, if you were to say that you were going up into the mountains, and you were going on a trip through the mountains, and you were going north, and then somebody else said that they were going on a trip through the mountains and they were going south. So which one of them would be going uphill? The north, right? Because north is up. And, I mean, where did we get that? It's somehow the name means up and the name means that. We just associated that for some reason. But think about the names that we have for people, names we have for children, our own names. I mean, names make us think of something. People's names, there are lots of names that are actually words. People's names are just standard words like, grace and what else? I don't know. There's hundreds of them. I know they're out there. Peace. Yeah. What? Oh, Lane is one of them. Faith? Yeah, faith. They see we got all these faith-oriented names, and they mean all kinds of things, but they're also names for people. And when we see those people, it makes us think about those kinds of things. So Jesus had a load of names that people referred to him by. Tons of names. And each of those names was given to Jesus because it meant something about who he was and what Jesus was meant to do. It had to do with Jesus' mission, it had to do with Jesus' plan, it had to do with what God was doing in a bigger scheme, all kinds of things wrapped up in these names that referred to Jesus. Well, one of these names, these most common names that Jesus was called, is perhaps the most common name that Jesus was called all the time by people. And this was the name King. Jesus was referred to hundreds of times as King. And it wasn't just an arbitrary thing. It was a name that was given to Jesus because it meant something. And as the last 4 weeks during this Advent season, we've been looking at different names for Jesus. We've been looking at these different names that were given to Jesus because they meant something about who Jesus was and what God sent Jesus to do. And as we look into those, as we dig into this, we decode those names, we figure out more of God's plan through Jesus. Why Jesus matters. And what is it about that name that brings a whole new level of life to faith in Jesus? So if King was that important of a name that people called Jesus King all the time, what does it mean? Why does it matter? What does it contribute to faith and understanding Jesus, especially at Christmas? So, what does Jesus as King mean? And what does it have to do with things? Well, we're going to watch something just for a couple minutes that will help introduce this whole theme of King. So if you would, take a look at the screen.
The Gospel of Luke. Luke investigated many of the earliest eyewitnesses of the life of Jesus and then composed this account.
And the story begins up in the hills of Jerusalem, the place where Israel's ancient prophets said that God himself would come one day to establish his kingdom over all the earth.
In the city is the temple, run by the priests. And one of them, named Zechariah, was working in the temple when he had a vision that freaks him out. An angel appears and says that he and his wife will have a son. What's this all about?
Well, Zechariah and his wife, we're told, are very old. They've never been able to have children. And Luke's setting up a parallel here with Abraham and Sarah, the great ancestors of Israel, because they too were very old and could never have kids.
Yet God gave them a son, Isaac, which is how the whole story of Israel began.
And so Luke's implying here that God's about to do something that significant for this people once again.
The angel tells Zechariah to name the son John.
And then he says that this son's going to fulfill a promise of Israel's ancient prophets, that somebody would come one day to prepare Israel to meet their God when he arrived to rule in Jerusalem.
Because right now, Jerusalem is ruled by the Romans.
Yeah, specifically, it's governed by a man named Herod, who's a puppet king under the Roman Empire. And so the Jewish people wanted nothing more than to be free and govern themselves in their own land.
So this is shocking news. Everything's going to change. God's on his way. But how is he going to arrive?
Well, to find out, Luke takes us out of Jerusalem and then up into a small town in the hills of an out-of-the-way region called Galilee. There we find a young woman named Maria, or we call her Mary. She was engaged to be married.
And then an angel appears to Mary, saying that she's going to have a son.
She's supposed to name him Jesus, which in Hebrew means the Lord saves. And he will be a king like David, who will rule over God's people forever.
And then Mary asks, okay, well, how is this possible? Because I'm a virgin.
And she's told that the same Holy Spirit that brought life and light out of darkness in Genesis chapter 1 is going to generate life inside her womb. God is about to bind himself to humanity through the conception and the birth of the Messiah.
And so Mary goes from some backwoods, no-name girl to the future mother of the king.
Exactly. In fact, she sings a song about how this reversal of her own social status points to a greater upheaval to come. Through her son, God's going to bring down rulers from their thrones and exalt the poor and the humble. He's going to turn the whole world order upside down.
So the history of God's people is really a history that's filled with kings. People knew kings. We don't live in a world of kings, but they lived in this world that was filled with kings. In fact, for hundreds of years, their world had been filled with kings. This was actually against God's better recommendation that their past and their history was filled with kings, but it still was. The kings were in power for several hundred years, as the Old Testament tells story after story about these kings. And this is so much the heritage of all the people who were around in Jesus' day, who were seeing this now king come on the scene. So for them, they have an understanding of kings. They know that kings have ruled for all kinds of time, for generations. And they were kings that were supposed to keep people safe and help people do God's will and help people to fulfill the mission that God has for them. Well, these kings didn't always do their job very well. In fact, most of the kings did not do the will of God and did not perform the way that God wanted them to. But God continued to supply kings for these people. A few of the kings, in fact, were good. Some of these kings really did do God's will. But for the most part, Israel was in a very tough situation, as the Old Testament tells. They got exiled, they got defeated, the kings were not the ones who were saving them, the kings weren't doing their jobs. And it got really, really bad. At one point when it got really bad, God started making some amazing promises. And these promises were that God was going to do something completely different. That God was going to bring a brand new kingdom unlike anything that they had ever seen. God would even bring a new ruler unlike the rulers that they had ever seen. And so the big prophet Isaiah, the one that people looked at and turned to, and he did so many things to encourage people and point them toward God, Isaiah described this new king in this way. Isaiah said, "For a child is born to us, a son is given to us. The government will rest on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. His government and its peace will never end. He will rule with fairness and justice from the throne of his ancestor David for all eternity." Now, if you're a people who's been defeated and exiled and defeated again and displaced from your homeland and all your hope is taken away about anything that you've ever known, this sounds pretty awesome. That this could actually happen. A new government, a fairness, justice, a child that's going to grow up and be this ruler. I mean, this sounds amazing, doesn't it? This is something that you'd be hanging on to. Something that you're like, I want that someday, because what I've experienced in my generation is nothing like that. So God, if you're going to promise that, that's the kind of thing that I'm going to hang on to. That's the kind of ruler that I want. I mean, look at all the things that this passage says that this person will do. I mean, government's going to rest on this person, and fairness and justice will come through. He will even be from the throne of David. And David was like the pillar of whoever a king is, for the most part, supposed to be. So they're thinking, well, this has got to be what kind of person? To be able to have a government and peace and fairness and justice and be in the line of King David? I mean, it's got to be a king, doesn't it? So they were looking for a king. And for hundreds and hundreds of years after this, people kept looking for somebody who was going to do this, and that could only be a king. But it may not be a king like they were looking for. Maybe it was a little bit different kind of king. So fast forward, Jesus comes on the scene. People start talking about Jesus as if Jesus is a king. People start giving Jesus the name king. All kinds of people were referring to Jesus as a king. And people have all kinds of reactions to this. At first, there was John the Baptist. And John the Baptist came on the scene before Jesus as one who was, as he says, preparing the way for Jesus to come. And John took this job seriously. On John the Baptist's shoulders, he said, well, I'm the one who is preparing the way for the Lord. In fact, he even reached back to Isaiah's other words, some other words that Isaiah said that described his job. And the words were these: "Look, I am sending my messenger ahead of you, and he will prepare your way. He is a voice shouting in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord's coming, clear the road for him." And John thought this was his job. He was the preparer. He was the one who was supposed to prepare the road and the way for the Lord's coming. This is regal, kind of kingly kind of language. Because whenever a king came to town, they had to prepare the road. Because the roads got rained on and rutted out with carriages, and they had to make a smooth ride for the king to come into town. You wouldn't let a king come into town on a rough, bumpy road. You wanted them to be comfortable when they came in, so he knew that you were preparing the way for him. But John also knew that there was more to the story. He knew that there was something more than just preparing the road for a king. He knew that there was somebody, not just something, that he was preparing for. And this person, this king, would do something different. He was preparing that way for this king. Well, then there was King Herod. We saw King Herod up here just a minute ago, and King Herod had a very different reaction to this king. He was the king. Herod was the king, and nobody else was king. And Herod was under the emperor, and his job was to make people feel good about the emperor, to obey the emperor, to follow the emperor, to do whatever the emperor wanted. And nobody else was going to take that role, that kingly role, away from Herod. So, when these wise men come, and these wise men say, hey, we're here to see the king of the Jews, Matthew describes how Herod felt. He says, King Herod was deeply disturbed when he heard this, as was everyone in Jerusalem. I mean, there is no way that King Herod, in all his power and all his situation and all his control, is going to let some other king take his place. So he feels threatened, and he feels there is no way this is going to happen. So he is deeply disturbed, and he decides that he's going to do whatever it takes to keep that king out of power. Well, who else understood who this Jesus might be? How about the wise men? These wise men are some of my favorite characters in this story. Mostly because they have none of this background. They're not in the Old Testament. They don't know the past. They don't know all of this Hebrew Jewish stuff. I mean, they're 600 miles away in some totally different country, speaking a different language, and they're astrologers. Their job, their profession, their passion even, is to look up at the stars and determine what the stars say. And what they've determined is that the stars are so regular. The stars do the same thing all the time, year after year. And they've studied them, and they have all this data about them. And so when they see that something's weird or unusual, that's when they say, hold on, something different's happening. So what do? They see this, whatever the phenomenon was in the sky, convergence of stars, some bright stars, who knows what it was, that they saw something that was so radically unusual that they mounted their camels and they rode 600 miles for months to go figure out what it was. And they also matched it up with some story about what was supposed to happen in this area of the world, because what is it that they say to King Herod when they see him? Who is it that they're searching for? They say, "Where is the newborn King of the Jews? We saw his star as it rose and we've come to worship him." I mean, that's remarkable that these star decoder guys come all this way and they've determined that it's the King of the Jews. We came to see his star. So what did they bring with them? We all know what they brought with them. They brought gifts, 3 gifts, and the gold, the frankincense, and the myrrh. It describes it. They entered the house, and they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasure chests and gave him gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. Those are valuable gifts. And those are specific gifts that people gave to who? Kings. They figured it out, and they were part of the people. It's pretty cool. Well, there's one more person who called Jesus a king, and it was way after the first Christmas. Ever heard of Pilate? Pilate was the governor. He was the person in charge of Jerusalem and this whole area. And he's the one at the end of Jesus' life that had the conversations and tried and sentenced Jesus. And when he has these conversations with Jesus, here's how it goes. He asks, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Pilate asked Jesus. Jesus replied, "Is this your own question? Or did others tell you about me? My kingdom is not an earthly kingdom. My kingdom is not of this world." Pilate said, "So you are a king?" Jesus responded, "You say I am king." Right? Pilate didn't even know what to do with the idea that he was a king. Because for Pilate's world, he knew what a king was. I mean, he was a governor. He knew how kings operated, what kings looked like, and what kings did. And did Jesus look like a king? No, I mean, he's about to die. He's getting tried. And people are against him. He's like, this is not what a king is supposed to do. You can't possibly be a king, but you say you're a king. Are you a king? He does not know what to do with this idea that Jesus is a king. Well, for sure, Jesus was some kind of king. I mean, lots of people agree that at least he was a king, even if they didn't know what to do with the idea that he was a king. How can one simple name, 4 letters, do this much and cause this much confusion and upheaval and revelation and excitement all at the same time? How can a king or a label or a name just do that? Well, it's because he's the kind of king who came to be not necessarily the kind of king that we expected. Jesus is the kind of king who can rule the world in the right way, not just the way that other kings have ruled. Jesus is the kind of king who can provide for us like kings have never provided for their people before. Jesus is the kind of king who can deal with not just the now, but who can deal with the forever. Jesus is the kind of king who doesn't just reign and control, but who loves to serve. And we don't see those kinds of kings very often. Jesus is the kind of king who takes off the crown from his own head and he puts it on our heads so that we can be part of the great king's family. That's the kind of crazy king that Jesus is. And And Jesus didn't provide all the answers about what this looks like. He didn't give us a script for what kind of king he is. He didn't give us all the details and answer all the questions that we might have about what a king can be and what a king can do. And that's because it's our job to figure it out. As we've been learning about these names, we're decoding them. We're trying to figure them out. And that's what the relationship with God, the life with Jesus, is about. It's trying to decode this and figure it out and find the deeper levels of understanding about who is this and what did he really come to do. That's the joy and that's the journey that we get to be on together. Christ is the King. And we get to celebrate that Christ coming as a king for you and me at Christmas. Let's pray.